In Britain, there are castles that survived invasions, plagues, and centuries of war, only to be brought low by the people who owned them. That's worth sitting with for a moment. These weren't structures that crumbled because nobody cared. Some of them stood for 600 years. Some had walls thick enough to absorb cannon fire. They endured everything that history threw at them. And then, quietly, deliberately, they were emptied, locked, left. Most people assume that ruins are the work of time, and sometimes they are. But the 10 castles in this list are something else entirely. Each one was abandoned by choice, and each choice had a reason that the people involved preferred not to put on the record. Before we begin, there's something you should know about number 1 on this list. It was abandoned so abruptly, so completely, that personal belongings were still inside when the doors were sealed. No family has ever publicly explained why. The official record is silent, and as far as anyone can tell, it's going to stay that way. Start at number 10. There's a particular kind of pride that only the English aristocracy truly mastered. The art of appearing completely fine while the whole thing collapses underneath you. Seton de Laval Hall in Northumberland isn't a castle in the medieval sense. It's a baroque palace, built in the early 18th century for Admiral George de Laval by the architect John van Brugge. And from the outside, even now, it looks like the sort of place that has always been in good hands. The proportions are confident. The stone is dramatic. You could stand at the gates and reasonably assume it still belongs to someone powerful. It doesn't. And for most of the last 2 centuries, it didn't belong to anyone who could actually afford it. The de Laval family was extraordinary in ways that made their eventual collapse almost inevitable. They were extravagant, theatrical, constantly in debt, and utterly incapable of living within any reasonable means. By the early 19th century, the male line had died out, and with it went whatever financial structure had kept the estate nominally functional. In 1822, a fire gutted the central hall. And here's the part that matters. Nobody repaired it. That wasn't poverty exactly. It was a decision. The remaining heirs, scattered and disinterested, chose to let the ruin stand as it was rather than sell it or surrender it to anyone they considered beneath their station. The scorched interior sat open to the sky for over 100 years. Servants' quarters slowly emptied. The grounds went to seed. What remained was a shell that looked, from certain angles, entirely intact. The family's dignity, preserved in stone. Their finances, visible in the blackened rafters. There's something almost admirable about the sheer stubbornness of it, and something deeply melancholy about a pride that could only express itself through controlled decay. The National Trust eventually acquired the property in 2009. The restoration is ongoing, but you can still see the fire damage if you know where to look, and you wonder, standing there, whether anyone ever seriously intended to fix it at all. After the Second World War, Britain introduced a system of death duties so aggressive that it effectively dismantled the hereditary aristocracy in slow motion. Estate after estate found itself caught in the same impossible calculation: maintain the house or maintain anything else. Some families sold, some subdivided, and some, in a move that was equal parts pragmatic and quietly devastating, handed their properties directly to the government. Not out of generosity, but as a way of paying off tax debts that had become impossible to ignore. Needpath Castle in the Scottish borders has a longer history than most of the houses in this list. It sits above the River Tweed in Peeblishire, its 14th century walls still largely intact, its position on the hillside dramatic enough to have been painted by Turner. For centuries it passed between powerful families, the Frasers, the Hays, the Earls of Wemyss. It was never exactly neglected. It was simply by the mid-20th century no longer sustainable. The particulars of how Needpath ended up in limbo are less dramatic than some entries on this list. There was no scandal, no single catastrophic event. There was just the grinding arithmetic of inheritance tax, multiplied across generations that had already watched their fortune shrink. At a certain point, keeping the castle going stopped being a question of will and became a question of maths. What's strange about Nightpath is that it didn't completely disappear from life. It's been opened occasionally, rented out sporadically, glimpsed by tourists from the hillside, but it has never been genuinely inhabited again. Not in the way that turns a building into a home rather than a monument. It belongs in some nominal sense to someone. In any real sense, it belongs to nobody. That's the particular sadness of the tax surrender castle. It wasn't abandoned in anger or in grief, or even in shame. It was abandoned in paperwork. Some families, when faced with the end of their bloodline, sell. Some donate. Some subdivide and move somewhere manageable. And some simply refuse. Woodsome Hall in West Yorkshire is a case that doesn't get spoken about much, which is itself a small clue. The hall dates to the 15th century, and for generations it was the seat of the Kay family, a name that once carried considerable weight in the West Riding. By the late 19th century, the male line had thinned to almost nothing. The remaining heirs were women, elderly, and in no position to manage an estate of that scale. And they were, by all accounts, deeply suspicious of anyone outside their immediate circle. The question of what to do with Woodsome when the last of them died became something that nobody asked aloud. The preference, never stated officially but clear enough from what followed, was to let it stand. To sell it, or give it to an institution, or open it to the public, would have felt like a kind of surrender. The Kays had been there for centuries. Letting strangers walk through the rooms was, apparently, unthinkable. What happened after the last heir died is a study in how quickly a building declines without a single act of deliberate destruction. Just absence. Windows that let in water. A roof that wasn't repaired in time. Grounds that returned to something close to wilderness. The hall survived. It's a Grade 1 listed building, and it's still standing. But the years of deliberate non-management left marks that restoration work can only partially conceal. There's a stubbornness in this story that's almost magnificent. A family that chose extinction over compromise. You can't quite call it admirable, but you can understand it in a dark sort of way. This is where the tone of this list shifts, because from here onward, the reasons get harder to read. Poltalloch House in Argyll, Scotland, is not well known. That's interesting in itself because in its day it was genuinely impressive. A mid-Victorian mansion built for the Malcolm family in the 1840s, designed by the architect William Byrne, and completed at a cost that was extraordinary, even by the standards of the era. The Malcolms were wealthy. The house reflected that. It was built to last. It was abandoned in 1957, and the explanation that the family offered, that it had become too expensive to maintain, has never quite satisfied everyone who has looked closely at the timeline. What happened inside Poltalloch House in the years before it was abandoned is not, strictly speaking, documented. What is documented is a series of deaths within the family during the 1940s and 1950s, some in the war, some not, and a pattern of behavior from the surviving heirs that moved quickly from withdrawal to complete severance. By the time the last decision was made to close the house, it had already been largely emptied. The decision, when it came, felt less like a financial calculation than a conclusion. The building was deliberately unroofed, meaning the lead was stripped from the roof to recoup some value, which is a recognized way of making a structure uninhabitable and therefore legally simpler to abandon. Once a roof goes, the interior follows within years. The process is quick. Once it starts, what the family was trying to leave behind isn't something anyone has put on record. That, too, is a kind of answer. When the British government requisitioned private properties during the Second World War, it did so with a promise, implicit, if not always explicit, that the buildings would be returned in reasonable condition. That promise, in a surprising number of cases, was not kept. Broadsworth Hall in South Yorkshire is perhaps the best documented example of what requisitioning actually did to the great houses. Taken over by the military in 1940, used for the housing of troops and, later, for various administrative purposes, it was handed back to the Thellusson family after the war in a state that could be described, generously, as damaged. The military had not been careless out of malice. They simply hadn't treated the building as a home. Floors that were designed for domestic life had been subjected to industrial use. Heating systems had been pushed beyond their limits. Decorative plasterwork, irreplaceable and centuries old, had been damaged in ways that were never going to be cheap to fix. The family looked at what came back to them and made a decision that was, perhaps, understandable. They continued to live in part of the house, but they stopped trying to restore the rest. Room by room, the unoccupied sections were simply closed. Furniture left in place, curtains drawn. The clock stopped at no particular symbolic moment, just the moment when someone stopped winding them. By the time English Heritage took possession in 1990, parts of the house had been sealed for decades. The process of conservation, rather than restoration, began. They chose to preserve the decay rather than reverse it, because the decay had become part of the record. That decision, strange as it sounds, was honest. This is what happened here. The damage is real. We're not pretending otherwise. Before you dismiss this one, hear it out. Because the word curse is doing something specific here. It's the word that the family itself eventually started using, privately, for what kept happening to them. Glamis Castle in Angus is famous enough that it almost doesn't need an introduction. It appears in Macbeth. It was the childhood home of the Queen Mother, and it has been connected to ghost stories for as long as anyone can remember. But there's a lesser-known chapter of the Glamis story that tends to get skipped over in favor of the romantic version. Beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating through the first half of the 20th, the Lionbaus Lyon family experienced a sequence of deaths, disappearances, and sudden reversals of fortune that went beyond what actuarial probability would comfortably explain. 3 heirs died young. 2 others removed themselves from family life in ways that were never fully explained. A branch of the family that had seemed secure simply ceased to function as a unit within the span of a single generation. None of this led to the castle being abandoned. Glamis is still occupied, still operating, still open to the public. But there were years, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, when the question of whether anyone would be left to inherit it felt genuinely open. The family referred to a curse not because they believed in the supernatural, necessarily, but because they had no better framework for what kept happening. That's the most unsettling version of a curse, not the superstitious kind. The kind where you run out of other explanations. Political scandal, in Britain, has a long tradition of being managed rather than addressed. The preferred method is silence. And, where silence isn't quite enough, distance. Physical distance. The kind that comes from closing a house, selling an estate, and ensuring that nothing in the landscape reminds anyone of what happened. Sherborne Castle in Oxfordshire sits behind walls that are, even now, almost entirely concealed from the road. It has been in the Parker family, the Earls of Macclesfield, since the early 18th century. What brought the most recent chapter of its story to a quiet close was something that unfolded in the early 2000s, and which ended in one of the more remarkable criminal cases involving a member of the British peerage in living memory. Thomas Parker, the 8th Earl of Macclesfield, was convicted in 2007 of theft and false accounting. The crimes involved the manipulation of family trust funds that had, among other things, been intended for charitable purposes. The scale was significant. The embarrassment was total. The castle didn't close the day the verdict came in. But the closure, when it came, had a different quality to it than the financial or dynastic abandonments earlier on this list. This wasn't a family running out of money or heirs. This was a family running out of credibility. The stone walls of Sherborne had absorbed centuries of the Parker family's identity. After 2007, that identity was no longer something anyone was eager to display. Some ruins are made by weather. Some are made by time, and some are made by the morning papers. There are buildings in Britain whose files are still classified, not because they contain military secrets exactly, but because opening them would require someone to explain decisions that no one, at this point, wants to be responsible for explaining. Kinloch Castle on the Isle of Rum in Scotland is one of the stranger properties in this list. Not because it was sealed by court order or criminal investigation, but because the chain of authority that led to its current state involves several governmental bodies, conflicting heritage designations, and a management dispute that has been running, in various forms, for decades. Built in 1900 by the Bullough family as a private sporting retreat, Kinloch was extravagant almost beyond reason. The bricks were shipped from Dumfriesshire. The soil for the gardens was imported from the mainland. The interior featured orchestrelles, a billiard room, and a heated seawater swimming pool. It was a fantasy in stone, built by a man who had made an industrial fortune and wanted somewhere to spend it. When the Bulloughs sold Rum to the Nature Conservancy in 1957, the castle came with it. And then the arguments started. Who was responsible for the upkeep? How much was it worth preserving? What would it cost? The answers to these questions, over the following decades, were never quite resolved, which meant that the building sat in a kind of administrative limbo, while the roof slowly deteriorated and the interior slowly absorbed moisture. Access to Kinloch today is restricted. Not completely. Small groups can visit, carefully managed. But the reason the building is in the state it's in isn't weather. It's paperwork. It's competing jurisdictions. It's nobody quite being able to say who was supposed to fix it, and when, and with whose money. That's not a conspiracy. It's something arguably more troubling. Institutional indifference, operating at a pace slow enough to look like neglect, rather than decision-making. This one is unusual, because what happened here wasn't just the abandonment of a building. It was the deliberate obscuring of its existence. Midmar Castle in Aberdeenshire is, technically, still standing. It's a Z-plan tower house from the 16th century, well preserved in structural terms. And it has been in a complicated legal situation for long enough that the history of who owns what is genuinely difficult to untangle. But there's something more specific that sets Midmar apart from every other castle on this list. For a period of several decades in the 20th century, Midmar did not appear on certain editions of the Ordnance Survey maps of the area. This wasn't an error. The area around the castle had a particular significance. And there are people who have argued, with some evidence, that the omission was deliberate, that someone, at some level of the relevant bureaucracy, decided that having this particular structure visible on publicly available maps was not in certain interests. The reasons for that decision, if it was indeed a decision, have never been officially acknowledged. The castle reappeared on maps eventually. The gap in the record was never explained. What you're left with is this: a 600-year-old structure that someone considered inconvenient enough to quietly erase from the official record of the landscape. Not destroyed, just made, temporarily and officially, invisible. That is a particular kind of power, and a particular kind of admission. Some stories don't resolve. And the responsible thing, the honest thing, is to say that up front, rather than pretend there's an explanation waiting at the end. Gryche Castle in North Wales is, on the surface, a ruin with a fairly straightforward history. Built in the early 19th century by Lloyd Hesketh Bamford Hesketh, it was a Gothic revival showpiece. Towers, battlements, terraced gardens cascading down a hillside above the Irish Sea. It was never really a castle in the medieval sense. It was a statement, a monument to the idea of permanence. What happened after the Bamford Hesketh line ended is where the story becomes harder to follow. By the mid-20th century, the estate had passed through several hands, including briefly a period of use during the Second World War when it housed Jewish refugee children from Europe. After the war, it passed to an American heiress named Winifred Cochran, who had married into the family and who treated the castle as a private retreat. She spent part of her life there, spent extended periods away, and died in 1985. And then the abandonment happened. Not slowly, not over generations, not through any visible financial crisis. The castle was left, quickly, completely, with furniture still in the rooms, with personal effects still on the shelves, with no public statement and no official explanation. The family, such as it was by then, did not appear. No one accepted responsibility for the building. Local communities watched the structure deteriorate for years. Vandalism took hold. The gardens that had been maintained for over a century turned to undergrowth in less than a decade. Copper was stripped from the roof. The interior, which had once housed a ballroom and 36 bedrooms, was open to the sky. Why? There are theories. There are suggestions of disputed ownership, of family disagreement, of legal complications that made any decision about the property functionally impossible for years. None of these explanations quite accounts for the abruptness of the ending. The sense that whoever made the decision to walk away did so in a moment rather than over time. A charity eventually took over the site. Restoration work has begun, slowly. Gorich is alive again, in a limited sense, but the question of why it was left the way it was has never received a satisfying answer. The family has never spoken publicly. The legal history is complex enough to be opaque. And what remains, beyond the walls, beyond the ongoing restoration, is a silence that doesn't feel accidental. Every castle on this list survived something. War, reformation, economic collapse, the slow grind of centuries. They were built to last, and they did, until the moment when the people responsible for them decided, for whatever reason, that lasting was no longer the point. That's the thing that stays with you when you look at these places. The buildings themselves weren't fragile. The decisions that undid them were made by human beings, in quiet rooms, at desks, in conversations that were never recorded. And what they decided, each of them, was that silence was better than explanation. The ruins are still there. The explanations aren't. And in Britain, of all places, a country that has spent centuries constructing an elaborate architecture of official record. The gaps in the story are sometimes the most telling thing of all.